Hello, I'm Terrence McNally, and welcome to another newly recorded episode of Free Forum, A World That Just Might Work. And I'm going to be joined today by Ali NOORANI. He's the Executive Director of the National Immigration Forum and the author of There Goes the Neighborhood, How Communities Overcome Prejudice and Meet the Challenge of American Immigration. But first, after hosting and producing the show for nearly 2 decades, in 2014 I stopped recording new live interviews, and the show continued on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn, streaming relevant interviews from the archives each week. And podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on iTunes, Podomatic.com, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same site. But with the election of Donald Trump, I couldn't resist exploring the path forward in new interviews. And this is the 25th such interview I've recorded since that election. Paul Hawken on climate change, Naomi Klein on her book No Is Not Enough, David K. Johnston on the daily dirty work of the Trump administration, etc. And they're all available on my website and at iTunes and Podomatic. And let me offer you a few websites for information on how to participate in resisting the Trump administration and the movement toward, and actually working for the movement toward a healthy and just future. Email me at temcnally@mac.com if you want to get these websites or more information. First, indivisibleguide.com. That's one word, Indivisible Guide. That's about the largest organization that's grown up since the election. I think 5,000 local chapters. OurRevolution, one word.com, the organization that grew out of the Bernie Sanders campaign. MoveOn.org, a longtime digital activist site which has been coordinating much more closely over the last year with grassroots organizers on the ground. Same for Courage Campaign, one word, couragecampaign.org, similar to Move On, but in the state of California. And two sort of specific ones, 5 Calls, that's the number 5, and the word calls, 5calls.org, which will tell you what the relevant and timely phone calls you might make to your representatives about impending legislation, and townhallproject.com, which will tell you when your representatives are coming to your local district and holding town halls, so you can go there and let them know what you want. And you can email me, as I said, at temcnally@mac.com if you want more info. So now to today's guest. Early in his new book, There Goes the Neighborhood, Ali NOORANI writes of December 18th, 2010. A day when Congress made 2 decisions. It repealed, don't ask, don't tell, the law barring gay and lesbian members of the military from expressing their sexual orientation, and it failed to pass the DREAM Act. And the lessons NOORANI draws from that experience speak loudly to the larger situation we find ourselves in today. Of immigration reform advocates, he writes, quote, "We did not understand the anger of those who opposed us. We did not understand the country's identity crisis, much less develop a strategy to address it. Consequently, we left in the hands of the opposition the hearts and minds of those we could have persuaded to support reform. When Americans were looking for an answer to their question of cultural identity, we gave them a political answer instead." Sound familiar? For the book, NOORANI interviewed nearly 60 local citizens and national leaders in faith, law enforcement, and business communities. And he tells their stories, how communities across the country are confronting immigration and the changing nature of American identity. The Trump campaign and the Trump administration have brought things to a head with the travel bans and the treatment of the Dreamers as headlines. NOORANI's commitment to crossing cultural barriers in order to achieve political ends remains strong. And I believe that what he says of immigration, that our cultural divide drives our political divide, is true of so many critical issues today. Ali NOORANI is Executive Director of the National Immigration Forum, an advocacy organization promoting the value of immigrants and immigration. He's a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley, and holds a master's in public health from Boston University. His first book, as I said, is There Goes the Neighborhood, How Communities Overcome Prejudice and Meet the Challenge of American Immigration. Welcome, Ali NOORANI, to Free Forum, A World That Just Might Work.
Thank you so much for having me, Terrence. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
Okay, and let me tell folks, we are recording this interview on March 7th, 2018. Now, I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we're going to talk about. So, Ali, how would you tell the story of your path to the work that you're doing these days?
Sure. Well, my parents immigrated from Pakistan, and they ended up in the Northern California region. And I was born in Santa Cruz, California, of all places, and ended up really growing up in Salinas. Now, Salinas in the late 70s through the 80s and 90s really was a community. Oh, I would say it was a small city, about 60,000 people. And the way I would describe it is that the majority of my friends growing up were either the children of farm workers or the children of farm owners. And looking back, I realized that growing up in a place like Salinas, where the South Asian community was really limited to the South Asian community that I related to, if you will, was really limited to my parents and my two sisters. Which really meant that very young in life, whether or not I realized that, I got to know people outside of my my ethnic community pretty well, pretty closely, and that's, I think, has guided what I do moving forward.
Mm-hmm. And you originally, as I said, you started out to work in public health. And what was it that led you to work in immigration?
Well, I ended up moving to Boston for a master's degree in public health, and a couple of years after I got the degree, I ran community health programs for two large health centers in Boston, the Dorchester House Multi-Service Center and the Codman Square Health Center. And I remember pretty early on in my 3 or 4 years there, where we had put together a community meeting I think it was like a Saturday afternoon, and one of the health centers had a very large Vietnamese population. In fact, the other health center had a very large Haitian and African American community. But with Dorchester House, where the Vietnamese community really came for services, we did this meeting between some Vietnamese youth and an immigration attorney active in the city. And it was at that point where I realized there was something fundamentally wrong with our nation's immigration system, because in that conversation, I learned that many of these Vietnamese youth that we were working with, providing after-school programs, et cetera, they had, they're kids. They did something stupid. Let's say they got into a fight or something. Their public defender said, well, plead guilty and you'll get community service. Well, these kids, they came as refugees. They came as immigrants to the country legally. But as soon as they pled guilty to that, relatively minor infraction, they were deportable.
Mm.
And it was at that moment when I just realized that there was a much bigger problem that we needed to address in the context of immigration policy.
Mm-hmm. So you're looking with this public health sort of vision, that kind of a site, and then you see it lies in the context of something much larger. Now, you write about an experience also around that period that made a big impression on you, the 2007 immigration raid in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Now, I was born in New Bedford.
Really?
Yeah, but I until I read your book, I only vaguely remembered hearing about this. Your ears prick up when they say, you're listening to NPR or something, and they mention New Bedford, but it had faded from my memory. This was pretty significant. Tell us about this and what impression it made on you.
Sure. This was in March 2007, and New Bedford is about 60 miles south of Boston. It's it's a city of about, let's just say, 70,000 people. It's a working class city. Does a lot of work. It's a major port for a lot of trade, a lot of the fishing industry in the Massachusetts area. And it's got a pretty diverse population, whether people who came from Portugal and the Azores generations ago, folks from Massachusetts, but then also more recently a large Central American population. So in March of 2007, the Bush administration conducted a large immigration raid, and this was probably the second high-profile immigration raid of the Bush administration. In this case, they detained and put into deportation proceedings about 360 Guatemalan workers who were manufacturing backpacks for the military at a factory in New Bedford. The Massachusetts Immigrants and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, the organization that it ran at the time, we worked with local organizations to lead a response effort. And I remember we had set up a community crisis center, if you will, in the basement of Our Lady of Guadalupe Church in New Bedford. Within one or two nights of the raid, that church basement was packed with people. And I remember there's one particular incident that just always comes to mind, is that one of the we ended up working with a young man whose wife had been detained, and he was desperate to get her out of detention because they had a young baby, and the baby was still breastfeeding, and it was the baby's health was really struggling. And we had set up an NPR interview for, I think, like 2 p.m., and around noon, immigration enforcement calls him and says, your wife has been released, you can pick her up here. So he bolts out of the church, and we figure, well, he's not coming back, he's set. But he returns at 2 p.m., and I remember we asked him, I said, why are you back? Your family is safe. And this was a young man who was not a community leader, just somebody trying to make ends meet. And he turns to us and says, this is my community. I need to be here. And it led me to realize, or really deeply understand, again, the impact of our immigration policies on families, but also the incredible resilience and leadership within the immigrant community.
Right. That he is saying, this is my community. Doesn't matter where I'm from. This is my community. Let me just say, by the way, for those of you to whom New Bedford is new, it's as a working class town. I was born there just after World War II, but it was the whaling capital. Moby Dick starts in New Bedford. Then whaling left, and it was the textile capital of the country, really. And then soon after World War II, all of the textile mills left and went to North Carolina because to avoid unions and to avoid labor. And as I was growing up, it was a very, gray and my memories as a young child, a very gray and sort of sad city that has made a rebound. I visited a few years ago, and it's in good shape. But as you say, it is a working class, very diverse community. Just another example of one of those in America. Now, the day that I mentioned in the intro, which was that date in which those two bills were considered by Congress, those two actions were considered by Congress. Tell us about that. You open your book with it because I think there's almost a direct line from that experience to this book.
Absolutely. And the day that you're talking about is December 18th, 2010. And on that day, it was a Saturday, so the Senate was in a special session, or a unique session, I should say, and in the morning, the Senate voted to defeat the DREAM Act, and in the afternoon, the Senate voted to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And as I started to kind of think through not just the book, the book I started in 2016, but really on that day in 2010, that afternoon, I remember turning to a friend and saying, you know what, we're going to do things differently next time. And at that point, I wasn't quite sure what that meant, but I knew that there was something that we in the immigrant rights community had done very differently than those in the LGBT community. So I looked back over the course of 2010, and those of us in the immigrant rights community, we ran a purely political strategy. We looked at the midterm elections. We said, okay, Nevada and Colorado are key states. Let's make sure that we are registering and turning out Latino voters in those two states. Let's pressure Democrats and Republicans so that if we're successful politically, then there's an opportunity to move legislation. Well, we won the politics, but we lost the legislation. Those who were advocating for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, over the course of that campaign, they never talked about politics. They never talked even about policy. They talked about what it means to serve your nation openly and freely, and really tried to convey a question of values to the American public. They successfully repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell by a wide margin. So for us at the National Immigration Forum, we said, okay, we've got to figure out what is the cultural strategy to engage the American public on this question of immigrants and immigration. Because, yes, politics is a big part of this, but if we're going to get to a win, we've got to figure out how we are engaging this cultural debate.
Okay, and that really does. When I said there's a direct line, I didn't mean that you set out to write the book that afternoon, but that the notion, that pivot that you made of, wait a minute, the answer is culture, or at least the context is culture, and the first step is culture. Politics will come later in this issue, and I believe, and tell me if you agree, that in this time of polarization, this may be true of a great number of issues.
Oh, absolutely. I think if you're looking at issues around poverty, around climate, access to health care. I
Even
mean, these
access
are
to guns.
even access to guns. Exactly. I think that all these political debates, underneath them is a really, really deep cultural divide. And what are the strategies and what are the ways that we heal that divide?
Okay, and let me ask you two questions sort of linked together. One is so at some point you do begin the book and you begin to there's a process that you take, and I'm not sure the process precedes the book or the book the process, but a process of engagement, as you call it, constructive engagement with people over those culture barriers to build cultural bridges. And when did you decide you were going to write this book?
So the process to develop and implement the strategy really began in January, February 2011, right after
Mm-hmm.
that 2010 Dream Act vote.
Mm-hmm.
And we worked, and quite frankly, what we did was we said, okay, we're not going to worry about the coasts, California, Oregon, Washington, the Northeast. Like the politics are set there. It's not relevant to the real challenge here. Instead, we're going to focus on the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Mountain West. These are the three regions where you had the least amount of support for something like the DREAM Act. You had the highest number of adults who identify as evangelical Christian. You have the highest density of state and local law enforcement, and you have the fastest growth in the foreign-born population. So,
Now,
organizationally,
let me step in for one
please.
second, because one thing that I think is surprising of those things you just mentioned was the last one. That among the South, the Midwest, and the Mountain West is where you have the greatest increases, percentage-wise, in foreign bomb population. Did that surprise you?
It did, because at that point in time, I had focused really on this left-leaning, energize the base, mobilize the base strategy, and therefore you focus on communities that are progressive or left-leaning. As soon as we kind of got out of that bubble and started looking more closely at the conservative parts of the United States, we began to understand, okay, what's triggering this debate? What's triggering this tension? And to see just the enormous growth in the foreign-born population in the Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee, through Kansas, number one, kind of led us to realize why business was moving to those regions, or young, fast-growing workforce, but also why these changes were triggering this really intense political debate in these conservative parts of America. So we had to figure out, okay, how do you work in those spaces? Because that's where the conversation is.
Now, I'm guessing that my family now lives in the South, lives in Atlanta, and I believe Clarkston, Georgia, this little town right next to Atlanta, is one of the most, I think, has one of the highest percentage of foreign-born in the whole country. But the Mountain West, I mean, it has been pretty white. So when we talk about movement into an area like that, the numbers may not be enormous, but it's the percentage, it's the change, it's the newness of it.
Exactly. So let's take a place like Idaho. Now, in Idaho, there are probably between 150 and 200,000 Latinos in the state of Idaho. Idaho, I don't know off the top of my head the total population, but it's a small state population-wise, and there's a relatively small amount of Latinos in the state of Idaho. But when you look at, in particular, the southern part of the state, it has the third largest dairy industry in the nation. It has an unemployment rate these days of around 3%. We do a lot of work with dairy owners in Idaho. They tell me to a person, I can't run my dairy without the Latino workers who have been with me for 5, 10, 15 years. And these are dairymen who, in the next breath, will say,
Mm-hmm.
and I voted for President Trump because I think he's going to solve America's problems.
Right.
So there's this, dissonance between a dairy owner saying, this worker who I'm shoulder to shoulder with every day is keeping my family-owned dairy open, but then in the next breath saying, but I have this, I voted for a president who ultimately wants to deport that person. So, the only way I think that you can actually, not just engage that dairyman, but the state of Idaho is like, okay, what's the economic case to be made for Latinos in the state of Idaho? But culturally, what does that mean for the state? Because then you help people kind of work through the concerns and anxieties, which are real.
Yeah, and one thing you said when you were saying that, that the same person holds two different views at the same time that seem opposed, it seems to me that if one looks kind of from a business view, as you end up doing when you make the economic argument, these kinds of things are both crises and opportunities, right? In other words, to you, marketing immigration, his need for that worker is an opening that you can cultivate.
Yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, in that.
No, because
yes,
I knew as I was saying it, I was pushing against the cultural bridge notion there. So yeah.
Right. So yes, absolutely. There is an economic, or there's a business bottom line to having a workforce that can get things done, right? And that dairy owner understands the economic impact of their dairy workers better than either of us. Certainly.
Sure.
But when I sit and talk with those dairy owners, they don't talk about their dairy workers as cogs in the wheel. They tell me stories of going to quinceañera celebrations, about a dairy worker's son or daughter graduating from high school and being the first in their family to go to college. So we have found whether it's Idaho or South Carolina, when that CEO, when that business owner is talking about their immigrant workforce as an extension of their community or extension of their family, it changes that conversation. So it's not just economic, but it's much more about the changing culture of a particular city, town, or community.
So it's very interesting. In other words, I see there's the political. You can look through a political lens. There's the economic, and then there's that cultural. And cultural almost seems like a stale word to describe it.
Right.
Because really, what you're talking about is human. Community stands for, culture stands for human interactions, human bonds, right? The stories we tell ourselves.
That's a great point, and and culture it's a good word because it's a catch-all word.
Yeah.
It's an unhelpful word because sometimes it's hard for people to say, okay, what does that really mean? But I think you're absolutely right. I think it boils down to ultimately how are people relating to each other, and in this time of demographic change, that question becomes all the more important to answer.
Yeah. Now, so you go out and you begin from, as I say, the book ends up being a product of this, but you begin a concerted effort to bridge these cultural differences all around the country. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Tell us how, and this may take a big chunk coming up here, but how is your constructive engagement playing out in Utah, South Carolina, California, Silicon Valley specifically? So first, Utah.
Okay. So in Utah for us was actually kind of a guiding experience because over the course of 2010, there were a handful of things that happened. Now, of course, I already talked about the DREAM Act vote in December, but in April of 2010, that's when we saw Arizona pass SB 1070, the Show Me Your Papers law.
Right.
For proponents of SB 1070, Utah was next on their list. And so they kind of had Utah in their sights, and they were going to start to kind of turn the wheels to pass legislation in the Beehive State. And what we found is that there was a conservative reaction to SB 1070 that was actually quite surprising. We had an organizer on the ground there, Carter Livingston, who started to work with others to kind of lift up conservative voices and start a public conversation on what would SB 1070 mean to the state of Utah. So, the Republican Attorney General, a former U.S. attorney, the Catholic Church, the Mormon Church to a certain degree, the business community. All of them started to kind of just, in essence, test the waters and start to make the case carefully of why in Utah, the values were different than in Arizona, and why in Utah the state always wanted to welcome and integrate immigrants and refugees. Over the course of the summer of 2010, 5 state workers took it upon themselves to send a list of a few thousand names to the Attorney General, the governor, and other law enforcement officials. And they made the case that these 5,000 names were undocumented immigrants taking advantage of public services. Well, in reality, it was 5,000 names with 5,000 Hispanic surnames, and that's it. And we did a press conference with the Attorney General and others, and I remember in the press conference, going into it, I kind of finally did some research, said, okay, who is this guy?
Mm-hmm.
And it was Mark Shurtleff, and the last time he was in national news, it was when he had tweeted from a execution, and he tweeted in favor of the death penalty. So I'm thinking, okay, got ourselves a conservative here. But he gets on the phone and starts to talk about the need for immigration reform, and a reporter asks him specifically about this list. And Attorney General Shurtleff says, well, this is not a blacklist, it's a hit list, and I'm going to do everything in my power to prosecute these individuals. So from my perspective, what it meant is that the law enforcement community, the business community, the faith community in Utah had developed a way to talk about these issues in a very, very contentious environment that were wrapped around Utah values. And that's continued to this day where, the Salt Lake Chamber, the governor's office, the state of Utah has really emerged as not just one of the most conservative states of the country, but one of the states that really works hard to advance constructive policies and narratives around immigrants and refugees in the state.
Let me just jump in for 1 second, and if I put myself in the position of that Arizona activist, anti-immigration activist who has passed 1070 and now is looking toward Utah, he's looking to a state that is highly, highly Republican, conservative, that was that had been very active or would turn out to be very active in the Prop 8 campaign in California against gay marriage and so on. And I think they see, oh, they're like us. And what you're saying is it turns out because of some deep-seated values, many of them in some sense coming from the Mormon faith, this is not the case.
Absolutely. And, as I was researching the book, I actually spent some time, I went back to Salt Lake and went back to Utah, and I spent an afternoon at General Conference, which is the biannual gathering of the LDS Church. And it was an amazing afternoon because that particular day was when there were a number of sermons about refugee resettlement and the controversy and the difficulty around it. And this was, spring of 2016. And I remember the silence of the audience as one of the elders spoke about the responsibility of the Mormon community to resettle and welcome refugees, whether in Europe or here in the States. And it was just clear that, from a church perspective, and to everybody that they were communicating with in that room, in that auditorium, much less across the state and around the world, they were really conveying a sense that as Mormons, it's our responsibility to be welcoming the stranger, and that that has just a deep cultural impact again across the political spectrum in the state.
Well, it's think about it. The Mormons were they were migrants. They left they started in the East Coast and they head west, and wherever they stop along the way, they are the stranger. And one thing that awoke me in reading your book was that I can't help it, but there's sort of, there's a stereotype that one has of provincial Mormons who, it's about family and it's about our religion and so on. But as you point out, because every Mormon takes a mission, and that mission often goes outside this country, they are actually, in some ways, more cosmopolitan than a lot of folks in big cities who would think of themselves much differently.
Absolutely, but then at the end of all of that, Utah is still a predominantly white state.
Yeah.
So it has this diverse range of experiences that people bring back to Utah, and that informs of how they relate to each other, but also how they see the world overall. And one of the other reasons why the LDS Church has been so active on this issue is that so much of their growth comes from, just like many faiths, comes from the immigrant community.
Yeah.
But what they were realizing is that undocumented immigrant members of the LDS Church who were about to go on their mission realized that they could not go overseas. They
Oh my
couldn't
God!
leave the
Right.
country. So the issue came up in all these different ways for church leadership, and they just realized that, we've got to take a position on this.
So you write about the Utah Compact, which came out of all of this work and ends up being sort of a model for others. What is the Utah Compact?
Sure. So in 2010, so after that incident, if you will, what happens is that the AG, the business community, they all realize that they've got to figure out how do they really advance a strategy that changes the narrative in the state. So over the course of the summer and into the fall, the group started to work together to come up with something that they called the Utah Compact. And it's very much based on the idea of the original pilgrims to the U.S. and the compact that they developed. And the compact ended up being a declaration of 5 principles to guide Utah's immigration discussion. And just to quickly summarize them, they included a focus on federal solutions, respect for rule of law, strong families as the foundation of successful communities. Fourth, from an economic perspective, that Utah is best served by a free market philosophy. And then fifth, that a value that they encompass as something that's as a free society, where immigrants are integrated into communities across the state, and that the state must adopt a humane approach to this reality. So what this group was able to do through the compact is say, these are 5 principles that guide a discussion. They don't necessarily need to be or translated to legislation, but they're principles that, whether you're a policymaker, a press, or just a layperson, should guide the way that we are thinking about this really contentious question that is, at that time and obviously today, roiling so much of the political debate.
Right. Now, by the way, that approach, and as you were listing those, if someone was listening for, well, wait, they're not mentioning immigration until maybe the last one. But as you say, if you establish a set of principles, then whatever issue comes before you, you have some ground and a perspective from which to approach it. And I always find that that even if someone also focuses on a particular policy, if you can start from principles, I think you get a much better chance of having a conversation and probably even being successful. Let me tell people, by the way, this is Freeform, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Ali NOORANI, Executive Director of the National Immigration Forum, and the author of There Goes the Neighborhood, How Communities Overcome Prejudice and Meet the Challenge of American Immigration. A couple of websites you can check out to learn more is Ali, A-L-I, hyphen Noorani, Noorani, A-L-I hyphen NOORNAI.com, or immigrationforum.org. What happened in South Carolina?
So sure, in South Carolina, I spent we've done a lot of work in South Carolina over the years, but I spent a handful of days there as I was doing research. And the Carolinas are really interesting because between South Carolina has seen the fastest growth in the Latino population, second only to North Carolina. So the state has seen tremendous demographic change. It's still, by and large, with the exception of a couple of urban centers, still a very Republican or conservative state. And the way that I wrote it is that as the textile mills moved from South Carolina to Mexico, it seemed that Mexico was moving to South Carolina. And that was partly because a BMW factory replaced the textile mills. Other manufacturers around that factory came into the state, and you saw a state that was able to continue to kind of thrive from an economic perspective and create jobs. So what I tried to do in South Carolina is really try to understand, okay, what does economic and demographic change mean to the culture of South Carolina? Because within that state, anywhere between 30 and 40% of individuals will identify as evangelical, and within that, even as Southern Baptists. So, you know, when you look at the polling, when you look at the research, it is by and large the white evangelical community in the South that really struggles with this question of immigrants and immigration the most strenuously, if you will. So I spent some time, for example, interviewing leadership of the First Baptist Spartanburg, one of the largest Southern Baptist churches in South Carolina. Met with a couple of educators in the state, as well as a couple of families, all within the upstate Spartanburg area. And what I learned was that, from a faith perspective, this very conservative church was eager to continue resettling refugees from the Middle East, regardless of their religion. From a law enforcement perspective, there was tension in terms of enforcement of immigration laws, and that tension was playing out so that Latino churchgoers were afraid to go to church because there was a cop with flashing lights helping people park. And then from an education perspective, I really began to understand what was the power of schools, both for children and for adults, in terms of helping the immigrant community integrate, but also helping the state better understand, what the challenges were that lay ahead.
Okay, and then one that you said you focused mainly on the sort of the red middle of this country, but how has constructive engagement played out in California?
Sure. So in California, you've got at least 5 different states. It feels like sometimes.
Yeah.
A lot of people will focus on kind of the San Francisco versus LA divide, but within the Central Valley, it gets politically and culturally pretty conservative. So I'll come back to Silicon Valley, but ended up interviewing Margaret Mims, who's a sheriff of Fresno County, born and raised in the area. Is the first female elected sheriff of Fresno. She herself was a Republican. And she told me about, leading the law enforcement community in Fresno County, but number one, making sure that her workforce was as diverse as the community that her workforce was patrolling. How her faith guided her values as the sheriff of Fresno County, but also as somebody who grew up working on the family farm. She sees herself every day as she drives through Fresno County and seeing immigrant families work on farms. And she said she always goes back to that experience of picking crops herself, and now seeing immigrant families do the same throughout Fresno.
Okay.
So I think in Central Valley, California, plays out in a way that's very different from Silicon Valley, which is obviously much more driven by the tech community and your engineer community.
Mm-hmm.
But even within Silicon Valley, these questions of documentation, whether you're dreamers or who are engineers or dreamers' parents who are janitors, how do they fit into this ecosystem that is Silicon Valley?
Right. Okay. This is good. I've got a sense of how you're reaching across and people are coming together. Let's take a few minutes here and let's just talk about the data. How many immigrants are there in the U.S.?
Sure. At this point, there are approximately 35 to 40 million immigrants in the U.S. overall.
That means people foreign born.
Correct.
So that's somewhere between 10 and 15% of the country?
Right. I think at last count, last number that I saw was the immigrant community is about 13 or 14% of the population overall, but about 16% of the workforce.
Okay. And how many are undocumented?
At this point in time, there are between 10 and 11 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S.
So, again, just to put that in context, a little less than a third of immigrants are undocumented?
That is correct.
Okay. And how do immigrants compare to other Americans on various things? I'm going to ask you. On crime.
Immigrants, documented or undocumented, commit crimes at rates lower than the U.S.-born population.
Okay. And education?
Education, it really depends on the country of origin. Folks from and also how long they've been here in the country.
Yeah.
Your model minority, it's a terrible phrase. An Asian immigrant will typically have come to the U.S. with higher education than a lower income immigrant from, let's say, Latin America. On the other hand, we're seeing, Mexico, for example, really increase dramatically the number of engineers that they're training and, frankly, exporting to the world. And that, ultimately, I think I would argue pretty strenuously that our economy needs both the skilled farm worker and the skilled engineer.
Right. And how do they compare? How do immigrant children compare on graduation and educational attainment?
We're seeing those numbers increase pretty quickly, and that you're seeing Latino graduation and college enrollment rates increase pretty dramatically. But still, Latinos will lag behind African American and white communities, and the Asian community will fall in, a little bit higher on the spectrum. But again, those numbers have really increased in terms of high school performance and college enrollment for the immigrant population overall.
Income and wealth.
In very similar to the education numbers, you'll see Latinos fall somewhere in between the African American and the white community, Asian community a little bit higher up. But again, that really depends on country of origin, skill set coming in, or education coming in. But over time, within one or two generations, you see those numbers even out pretty consistently across all ethnicities.
Oh, really? Within one or two generations of immigration, it begins to not matter?
Exactly. So, we'll see for the Latino community, children of Latino immigrants, U.S. citizen children, they're going to go through school, obviously much more likely to get a college education, much more likely to get a better job than their parents. And whether it's their generation or their children, they will compete. They're Americans, and they're competing with Americans who've been here for generations, American families who've been here for generations.
Okay, here's one. I'm going to put them together. Starting their own businesses, getting patents, being involved in innovation.
Sure. So 40% of Fortune 500 companies have been started by an immigrant or a child of immigrants. Some of your fastest growth in the small business community comes from the immigrant community. And, so much of this debate, for example, these days is tied around the idea of, family migration or chain migration. I would argue that, a good chunk of small businesses started by immigrant business owners are started because families are able to pool resources, which I think underscores the importance of family networks.
Right. I think anyone, whether immigrant or not, sees this, that there are sectors in which an immigrant population will throw their energy and help each other out. And one thing we know, I think, is that community is stronger in many countries from which people are immigrating than it might be here, and that extended family notion has more power, as it did for basically every wave of immigration as they came to the U.S., right? Whether German,
Exactly.
Irish, Italian, and so on. Immigrants are blamed for taking Americans' jobs. What's the reality on that one?
And the reality is that at the engineering kind of medical professions, in essence, your higher skilled set of professions, on the whole, immigrants are creating many more jobs than taking. When you get to, let's say, service sector or construction or agriculture, in the agricultural sector, every farm worker job will create or drive 3 jobs upstream or downstream that are typically held by somebody who's born in the States. So, a farm worker, the person selling the goods, transporting the goods, etc. The impact on wages is a little bit it's tougher at the lower end of the spectrum. Over the first 5 to 10 years, you'll see a small, less than 0.5% negative impact on wages among our lower wage jobs, but that impact will dissipate over time and turn into a net benefit. But I think it's important, as an advocate, to be upfront about it. There is, yes, a short-term, small negative impact on wages, at the lower wage industries, and we've got to figure out how we continue to grow our economy as opposed to shrinking our economy.
I saw a headline just in the last couple of days. Didn't have time to read the story, but it speaks to an issue beyond that headline, which is that there were some raids somewhere in Texas a few years ago. They deported a lot of folks so that they would open up those jobs for Americans, and the Americans never showed up. Are there jobs for which native-born Americans do are not there to fill those gaps if you remove the immigrants?
So I think that an American will do any job that is available. So I will never say that immigrants are doing jobs that Americans won't. I think that's an insult to just
Right.
the idea of
But there's
work,
got to
right?
be a however in there somewhere.
Then you look at the healthcare sector, the meatpacking sector, parts of construction, and you'll see an overrepresentation of the immigrant community, of the immigrant workforce in those particular sectors. You see that a lot within tourism and hospitality, and I think that's a function of where these sectors are located, the mobility of the immigrant workforce. People are much more likely to move from Michigan to Texas if they got to Michigan from China. So I think that there are a lot of factors that play into why some sectors have just a disproportionately high percentage of immigrants within them.
Okay, now that's interesting. In other words, you're saying that an immigrant population will be more mobile because their roots aren't as deep.
Exactly, and I think that oftentimes from an economic perspective, we have a tendency to kind of assume that every worker will move from one state to another for a job. But if somebody's been in a particular state for generations, and this I think comes up a lot in the Midwest, where there's just this assumption that if hey, you're unemployed in Ohio, we'll just move to Arizona. Well, that's not the way that people operate. People, they're from communities. So, immigrants, their roots are less set. So
well,
they're
they've
able to
already
move
they've already shown that they're willing to move.
Right.
That's who they are. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. How about how likely are immigrants to vote?
It really depends. Over time, over the last handful of election cycles, we've really seen the Latino and the Asian electorate really increase in terms of energy. Obviously, the Obama years really spoke to it. Now, this is the interesting part about this, is that in 2000 and 2004, President Bush got up to 40%, over 40% of the Latino vote. That number for Republicans has fallen dramatically as candidates at both the national level and the local level have, quite frankly, taken an anti-immigrant perspective on a lot of these questions. I think that in the long term, this is bad for not just Republicans, but I think bad for for our democracy if only one political party is talking to the fastest-growing electorate in the country.
Right. And let's talk about some of the issues, policy issues in the immigration area going on right now. What is the situation today for Trump's travel bans?
So his travel
and
ban
let me
has
just say again, this is we're recording this March 7th.
Right. So who knows what could change by the March 8th, much
Yep.
less the end of the day.
Yep.
So I think we are on version number 3 of the travel ban. Parts of it have been enjoined by the courts. We will anticipate we'll see this moving to the Supreme Court, if not this spring, this fall, and a determination, of ultimately what's the constitutionality. I think over the different versions, the administration has gone from kind of a blanket-wide ban on refugees and Muslim countries to a slightly more creative ban, where the majority of the countries that have been put on the travel ban are Muslim countries, but they also put North Korea on the list because we get a lot of tourism and travel from North Korea, and then Venezuela, but really just a handful of families or individuals from Venezuela are banned as well.
Right. I think,
but
it's
it's an ongoing legal question.
Just to make it not be a Muslim ban, perhaps.
Perhaps.
And what is the situation today for immigration policy in the U.S.? What are the chances? Obviously, we've seen, and let's throw the dreamers in here too. Okay, so we've seen for the last couple of months as the date, which was March 5th, right? That that dreamers would become more vulnerable as of March 5th, and the only thing that's stopping that is a legal decision so far. But we've seen, negotiations back and forth. We have a deal. Do we not have a deal? So, what is the situation today, and your sense of what might end up happening with A, dreamers, and B, the larger immigration policy?
Sure. So now, just to kind of go back to the beginning of the Dreamer conversation, not too far back, but in September of last year, the president decided that he was going to end the program on March 5th. So he, in essence, gave Congress about a 6-month window to pass a legislative solution. In early January, a federal court out of California enjoined his decision and said that U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services must continue to take renewal applications, not new applications, only renewals.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, about 700,000 individuals have protection from deportation and work authorization through DACA. March 5th as a deadline has been punted, if you will, because the court case is going to the case will wind through the circuit court and then probably get to the Supreme Court sometime this fall. That means that unless the administration figures out another way to end the program, renewal applications will continue. Congress, a couple weeks ago in the Senate, considered a handful of proposals. The proposal that got the greatest number of support, about 54 votes, was a bipartisan proposal put forward by Senators Rounds and Kuhn. The administration's proposal, which was deeply partisan, yes, addressed about 1.8 million dreamers, but also wanted to slash legal immigration by 40%, only mustered 39 votes. So I think that the market, if you will, the legislative market is really looking for a bipartisan approach. I think we are in a situation where unless Congress addresses this issue in the end of March omnibus funding bill, we're probably going to be looking at some sort of legislative solution this fall after the Supreme Court makes a decision.
Right. So punt from March 5th, and because of the courts, holding things up, that punt can take us to the fall. But I can only imagine what it is like to be one of those people, and you're trying to make plans. You're trying to get a new job. You're deciding whether to marry. You're deciding whether to go to graduate school, and you have no idea what will happen in the fall. Now, I'm going to put this in a larger context. I have lamented for years the isolation and the disconnect on both sides, both parties, of Washington, D.C. and the Beltway from the actual people of this country, the human beings that they supposedly represent. And you tell stories of successes, conservatives or social conservatives opening, changing their minds about human beings who are immigrants or refugees. But here's my question. Can these successes, these human-level successes, tip the scales when gerrymandering and money in politics gives us representatives who do not so much represent the human beings in their districts as they represent the extremes of their political bases and their funders? People in this country overwhelmingly support the Dreamers, but that may not matter. What's your perspective on this?
Well, I have two things here. Well, first of all, I think that, as destabilizing and as awful this process for DACA recipients and Dreamers has been, and even for their families and their employers. And remember, over 91% of DACA recipients are currently working. That means there are a lot of employers out there who are wondering what they're going to do if their kind of star employee loses their work authorization. But one upside of this Dreamer debate is that I think it has led millions and millions of Americans to realize that their kid's best friend is undocumented. The family one pew over church is undocumented. The family down the street is a refugee family. And I think that this crisis, this political crisis that the administration has created, has allowed people to kind of have a better understanding of the immigrants that they and their families relate to. So that's, I think, a big plus. Now, as we move into the midterm elections, the question, as you ask it, is, okay, how does this all play out? When the Cook Political Report has looked at all of the House districts, and they have found that 61 House districts represented by Republicans now are made up of voters that are moderately well off from an income perspective and more diverse than you imagine. That's all to say that there are a growing number of moderate and conservative Republican members of Congress who are representing increasingly diverse communities. Now, it doesn't mean that diverse community is always going to have an impact on that primary, but it means that general election becomes more and more competitive as we move forward. And a big point of discussion in these general election races this fall is going to be immigration, much less DACA.
Okay, and finally, I'm going to give you about a minute here. First of all, I'm going to read something you say, which is that our value proposition, and by that you mean the National Immigration Forum, is that if you hold a Bible, wear a badge, or own a business, you want a common sense solution to immigration. People see themselves in that situation, in that message. What's your word to folks who care passionately, either because they are immigrants, they are undocumented, or they care about it? What's your message to people, and where can they learn more? Where can they get involved? Websites, actions, etc.
I think the most important thing that we can do these days is tell our respective stories. And it's sometimes it can be a somewhat trite thing to say, but we found that when we are producing very simple digital videos where an immigrant is standing next to somebody who's been here for generations, and they are telling their story of when they met, how they met, how they work together, live together, share a community, it resonates in a deep and powerful way with the American public. So use every creative way that you can to tell your story. And there are a number of organizations across the country, or your church, your Rotary Club, et cetera, that provide a vehicle through which to tell that story. And then more than anything, I think we have to be optimistic about our future as a country, and I think that ultimately we can develop community again if we understand where each of us are coming from, because sadly I don't think we can depend on our political leadership to help us through that process.
Very good. So it's get involved, tell your story, be open about this, and then are there any, besides the National Immigration Forum, any other organizations that you want to point people to where they can either learn or get involved?
Sure. For folks who are interested in the Dreamer debate, United We Dream is one of the leading organizations at the national level in terms of organizing dreamers, in terms of understanding the cultural debate and what is different ways to engage from, let's say, an arts perspective. The Emerson Collective has been doing incredible work in terms of using arts and culture to advance a more constructive conversation.
How do you spell that?
Emerson.
Oh, okay.
E-M-E. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know if it was Anderson or Emerson. Emerson, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Anything else?
So those are just a couple. Yeah, those are a couple right off.
Okay, so we're going to bring this to a close. Again, the websites are alinoorani.com. That's Ali-Noorani, Noorani, alinoorani.com, and immigrationforum.org, one word, where you can link to Ali's podcast, Only in America. The book is There Goes the Neighborhood, How Communities Overcome Prejudice and Meet the Challenge of American Immigration. Thank you, Ali Noorani, and keep up your good work.
Really appreciate the opportunity, Terrence. Thank you.
For this conversation and many other interviews, articles, transcripts of interviews, and to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net or aworldthatjustmightwork.com, the same website. That's TERRENCEMCNALLY.net or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. If you want to receive my weekly email announcements that'll tell you who I'm going to be speaking with and what shows are going to air on Progressive Voices and when this is going to be on KPFK and so on, as well as every issue actually has about 6, 7, 8 articles that I choose, usually relevant to the topic or the week. If you want to do that, email me at temcnally, TEMCNALLY at mac.com, or you can sign up at my website. You can also subscribe and listen to Freeform on iTunes or Podomatic. You can find years of podcasts at my site or at iTunes. Michael Lewis, Jeremy Scahill, Robert Reich, Van Jones, Connie Rice, Greg Boyle, etc. Thanks to G, my engineer, Mark Maxwell in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all to you, my listeners. Please share this podcast widely.